freighter hauling salt toward Tucson slowed his mules when he saw it. A man on a crossbeam 12 feet in the air, lying flat on his stomach, arms through a mat of brush and saguaro ribs, tying knots he could not see. Below the crossbeam, 4 feet of open air. Below the air, a dark timber roof. Below the roof, somewhere inside, a child was coughing. The freighter watched the man pull a knot tight with his teeth, wipe blood from his palm onto his shirt, and reach for the next gap in the weave without climbing down. The wind was already changing direction. Calvin Morrow lifted his daughter from the wagon bed with both hands beneath her arms, and the heat rising off the cabin roof hit his face before his boots touched dirt. Morrow weighed almost nothing, 8 years old, and she weighed almost nothing, and the air tasted like hot iron, and the shack his dead brother Amos had built sat in the full sun of a June afternoon south of Tucson, like a box meant for storing punishment. He set her in the narrow strip of shade along the east wall. The shade was 11 inches wide. By the time he unloaded the first barrel, it would be gone. Amos had died in April. Fever first, then debt, then a grave Calvin had never seen dug by men Calvin had never met. What Amos left behind was precise in its cruelty, a 16 by 20 foot plank and log shack with no veranda, no lime wash. One window cut into the south wall where the afternoon sun poured in like liquid, a shallow well that slowed to a trickle past noon, and a signed note owed to a storekeeper named Ephraim Quill for $61 against the claim. Calvin had $31. He had 2 water barrels, a mercury thermometer wrapped in a rag, a box of wagon-building tools, and a daughter whose cough had started in Yuma and had not stopped since. The math was not complicated. $5 already owed for flour bought on arrival. $8 for the quinine and camphor Mara needed before the heat worsened. The return fare to Yuma by stage cost more than what remained in his pocket even before food, and Quill held the only signed paper on the well. If Calvin missed the August payment, Quill could seize the water. Without the water, the claim was dirt. Without the claim, Calvin was a widower with a sick child standing in a desert, with no roof, no money, and no direction home. He could not leave because there was nowhere to go that cost less than staying. The cabin was the wrong building in the wrong place. Calvin knew it within an hour. In Ohio, where he had spent 14 years repairing military freight wagons, a timber structure held warmth in winter and shed rain in spring. Here the dark planks swallowed sunlight from first light until late afternoon, and the roof rag rough-sawn boards Amos had hauled by wagon from a mill near the Santa Cruz became so hot by midday that Calvin could not hold his palm against it for a count of 3. The single room beneath it did not cool after sunset. It stored the heat in its walls and ceiling and released it slowly through the night, so that Mara lay on her blanket at midnight in air that felt thicker and hotter than the air outside. He hung the thermometer from a nail inside the cabin door and watched it climb past 100 degrees before noon on the second day. By 2 in the afternoon, it read 109. The mercury sat there, fat and stubborn, while Mara pressed her cheek against the packed earth floor because it was the coolest surface she could find. Calvin wet a rag and laid it across her forehead. The rag dried in 20 minutes. On the 4th day, a man rode up on a dun horse and did not dismount. He sat looking at the shack and then at Calvin, and then at the shack again, and his expression was the expression of a man being asked to admire a grave. His name was Beetle Crow, 61 years old, former Army teamster, former ranch foreman, current authority on everything built between Tucson and the Santa Cruz River, and he had known Amos. He had watched Amos haul that timber. He had told Amos the same thing he was about to tell Calvin. Beetle swung down and walked the property without asking permission. He put his hand on the south wall and pulled it away. He looked at the roof, dark planks with no whitewash, no overhang, no porch shade of any kind. He looked at the single window punched through the hottest wall. He crouched and studied the gap between the bottom log and the ground, where hot air pooled and insects entered freely. He looked at the well, low and slow, and at the two barrels Calvin had positioned in the only remaining shade, his own shadow, which moved every hour and protected nothing consistently. Beetle said, "You have timber where adobe ought to be." Calvin said nothing. Beetle said, "One window, no east porch, no lime wash. That roof will cook her by supper." He was not guessing. He was reading the building the way Calvin read a cracked wagon tongue, with the certainty of a man who had seen the failure before it finished failing. Your brother, God rest him, built a freight box and called it a house. Adobe would have given you mass. Mass holds cool air through the night and releases it slow. These planks do the opposite. They drink the sun all day and spit it back all night. You are living inside a stove. Calvin asked what he should do. Beetle listed the options the way a doctor lists treatments he knows the patient cannot afford. Thick adobe walls required mud, straw, water, wooden molds, and weeks of labor. A deep veranda required lumber Calvin did not have. Moving into town until September required rent Calvin could not pay. Each option cost money or time or both, and Calvin had a total of $18 left after flour and a half order of medicine. "The sensible thing," Beetle said, "is to sell the claim to Quill before August. Take whatever he offers and get the girl somewhere cooler." Calvin looked at Mara through the open door. She lay on her side with her knees drawn up, breathing through her mouth because the air inside was too hot to pull through her nose comfortably. "Quill wants the well," Calvin said. "Quill wants everything attached to dirt," Beetle said. "That does not change the arithmetic." He mounted his horse. Before he turned, he said one more thing, and it was the thing Calvin heard in his sleep for the next 6 nights. "That cabin is not a shelter. It is a slow oven with a door. If you stay in it as it is, the girl will suffer worse than she already is." He rode north. The dust from his horse settled on the barrels. Calvin stood in the doorway and felt the heat press against his chest from inside the cabin and against his back from the open sun. And for a moment he understood that he was standing between two kinds of burning, with no direction that led toward cool. He tried the obvious things first. Each one failed in a way that taught him something, but none of them solved the problem. He propped a canvas scrap against the west wall, angled to block the afternoon sun. The first gust of wind pulled it loose and dragged it 30 feet into the brush. He retrieved it, staked it tighter, and the next gust tore a seam. The canvas was too small, too thin, and too temporary. It was shade for a feed trough, not for a house. He sprinkled water across the cabin floor in the early afternoon, hoping evaporation would cool the air. The water vanished in minutes. The floor steamed. The humidity inside briefly rose and then dropped, leaving the air hotter and Mara's cough worse. He tried again with more water, draining a quarter barrel, and the result was the same. A few minutes of heavy damp air, then dry heat returning like a door swinging shut. He left the door and window open after dark, hoping the night air would flush the stored heat. Insects entered in clouds. Dust from a passing wind coated everything. Mara coughed until her ribs ached, and Calvin spent an hour sealing the window with a shirt and the door with a blanket, which trapped the heat again. Open or closed, the cabin punished its occupants. He traded a draw knife sharpening to a mason's apprentice for a bucket of lime and whitewashed a 4-foot section of the south wall. The white surface reflected light and felt noticeably cooler to the touch. But the roof, the largest surface facing the sun, remained dark and the roof was where most of the heat entered. Whitewashing the entire roof would require climbing onto a structure that was too hot to touch, using lime he did not have enough of, on boards that would need recoating after every dust storm. Each failure narrowed the question. The walls were a problem, but the roof was the worst offender. The roof faced the sky all day with nothing between it and the sun. Every plank absorbed direct radiation for 12 hours and conducted that heat downward into the room below. The walls at least had a few hours of shade as the sun's angle changed. The roof had none. Calvin lay beside Mara one night, unable to sleep, his hand resting on the ceiling board above his head. At midnight, the board was still warm. He could feel the day's heat leaving it slowly, like a coal buried in ash. The cabin was not just hot during the day. It was hot all the time because the roof never finished releasing what the sun had given it before the sun gave it more. He needed something between the sun and the roof. The ride to San Xavier del Bac took most of a morning. Calvin went to trade for corn. Dried corn lasted, and Mara could keep broth down even when the heat stole her appetite. He followed the wagon road southwest from the claim, and the land opened into the valley of the Santa Cruz, and the white walls of the mission appeared against the brown hills like a block of salt set on a table. What stopped him was not the mission, it was the space in front of it. Odom families worked beneath structures Calvin had no English word for. 4 posts, sometimes 6, driven into the ground and roofed with a thick mat of branches, mesquite, cholla stalks, what looked like dead saguaro ribs laid crosswise. With no walls, the shade beneath them was deep, not the thin shifting shade of a tree, where light leaked through in coins and stripes. This was solid shade, dense enough to darken the ground beneath it by several degrees, even to the eye. Calvin stood in the open sun with his shoulders burning through his shirt. Then he stepped beneath the nearest structure. The air temperature had not changed. He was still in the same desert, breathing the same June air. But the burning stopped. The sensation on his skin shifted from assault to tolerance. His shoulders relaxed. His squinting eased. The ground beneath the shade was cooler than the ground 3 feet away in the sun. He stood there for a long time, longer than was polite, watching the way the shade fell across a woman grinding corn and 2 children sleeping on a mat. 3 things registered. The shade roof was not trying to cool the air. It was blocking the sun before the sun could touch what was beneath it. The heat Calvin felt in his cabin was not air temperature alone. It was radiant heat, the sun striking surfaces and those surfaces re-emitting warmth. The Ramada interrupted the cycle at the source. The shade roof had no walls. Hot air entered from every side, rose through the loose mat, and left. There was no trapping, no box, no stove effect. The very thing that made Calvin's cabin unbearable, enclosure, was absent here. The shade structure was separate from what it shaded. It did not sit on the ground. It did not attach to a wall. It stood on its own legs, and the thing it protected was the space beneath it, not itself. That third detail connected to something Calvin had not thought about in years. In his father's wagon shop in Ohio, the blacksmith shed had a low iron roof that turned the workspace into an oven every August. Calvin's father had once raised a loose shade board on posts above the iron roof and showed Calvin what happened. The shade board intercepted the sun. The iron roof stayed cooler, and the gap between the 2 surfaces let rising heat escape sideways. The lesson was simple, and Calvin had filed it away the way children file away everything their parents demonstrate, without understanding it was knowledge until the moment it became survival. He bought the corn. He rode back to the claim. He did not speak to anyone about what he had seen, because the idea forming in his mind was not yet an idea. It was a question with a shape. What if he put a roof over his roof. He drew it in the dirt with a broken file, a rectangle around the cabin, bigger than the cabin by 4 feet in every direction, 4 posts outside the cabin walls, tall enough to hold a shade canopy above the existing roof, with a gap of open air between the canopy and the cabin. The proportions came fast because Calvin understood structures. He had built wagon beds that carried 2,000 pounds over mountain roads. He knew how a frame transferred weight and how joints failed, and how a post set in shallow ground would lean under lateral pressure. The cabin was 16 by 20 feet. The canopy needed to be 24 by 28 feet minimum to cast shade across the full roof, even when the sun was low in the west. The posts needed to stand at least 12 feet above grade, so the cabin roof, which peaked at roughly 8 feet, sat well below the canopy. That created a 4-foot gap, 4 feet of open air where rising heat could escape sideways and wind could move through without being trapped. Alejandra Carrillo found him drawing. She was 32, a Mexican-American widow who lived a half-mile south along the Wash, and she was the best adobe mason between Tucson and Tubac. She built walls the way Calvin built wagons, with a knowledge of materials so deep it lived in her hands rather than her head. She had known Amos, too. She had told Amos to build in adobe. Amos had not listened. She looked at the drawing in the dirt, and then at Calvin, and then at the drawing again. "Your thinking is real," she said. "The shade works. I have seen it work my whole life, but a Ramada shade's work, adobe shelter's life. What you are drawing is not a Ramada." Calvin asked what she meant. "A Ramada is small, 10 feet, maybe 12, close to the ground. The wind passes around it because there's nothing to catch. What you are drawing is 24 feet across and 12 feet tall. That is not a shade. That is a sail." She was not mocking him. Her voice carried the patience of a woman who had watched men fail at desert building for years and did not enjoy the pattern. "When the monsoon wind comes," she said, "and it will come because it comes every year, that canopy will lift like a tent. If it is tied to the cabin, it will pull the cabin apart. If it is freestanding, it will fly. You will lose the shade and possibly the house." Calvin stared at the drawing. The wind problem was real. He could feel it in his carpenter's instincts, the way he felt a weak joint before it cracked. The structure was too tall and too flat for the forces it would face. A wagon bed resisted wind because it was low and heavy. This canopy was high and light, but the shade was also real. He had stood beneath it. He had felt it on his skin. The principle was not wrong. The application was unfinished. "What if the shade is not solid?" he said. "What if it lets some wind through?" Alejandra looked at him. "Then it lets some sun through." "Not if it is thick enough in layers, loose enough to breathe, thick enough to block." She did not agree. She did not argue further either. She left him with the drawing and walked south along the Wash, and Calvin spent the rest of the afternoon on his knees in the dirt, redrawing the canopy with cross-hatched lines where the shade mat would sit and open gaps where the wind could pass. He counted what the project would cost. Posts he could cut from mesquite along the river bottom, but cutting and hauling mesquite alone would take days. Crossbeams he could salvage from the wagon bed, but that meant dismantling his only transport. Rawhide for lashing cost money at Quill's store. Iron straps for the windward corners cost more. Brush, saguaro ribs, and ocotillo wands he could gather, but gathering took time, and time was heat, and heat was Mara lying on the floor with a damp rag drying on her forehead. He calculated. All of it, every dollar and every hour spent on a structure everyone would call insane. If the canopy failed, if the wind took it, or the post snapped, or the shade layer was not dense enough, he would have spent his labor and his money on debris. He would not have enough left to buy passage anywhere. He would not have enough to rebuild. Mara would still be in the stove box, and he would be the fool who had bet her survival on a guess. He looked at the thermometer. 107 inside the cabin, 4 in the afternoon. He picked up the broken file and deepened the lines in the dirt. The mockery started before the first post hole was dug. Calvin walked into Quill's store the next morning to buy 2 auger bits, a coil of rawhide, and 3 used iron straps. He did not buy canvas. He did not buy medicine. He could not afford both the straps and the quinine, and the straps were the difference between a frame that held in wind and one that folded. He chose the straps. Ephraim Quill watched the purchases from behind the counter. Quill was 48, thin in a way that suggested appetite rather than deprivation, with a ledger always open and a pencil always moving. He bought distressed claims the way some men bought horses, studying the weak points, waiting for the stumble, and bidding low once the animal went down. He held notes on 4 properties between Tucson and the Mission, and Calvin's was the one with water. Quill tallied the purchases and did not ask what they were for. He waited. Calvin did not explain. Quill added the cost to the ledger under Amos Morrow's name, which was how he had kept the account, under the dead brother's name, a small cruelty that reminded Calvin whose debt this was. "Your brother owed $61, Quill said. "You have now added $4.15. The August payment is $20. That leaves you," he calculated aloud, slowly, making sure Calvin could follow, "with something like $6 or $7 for everything else between now and August." Calvin picked up the auger bits. "I mention it," Quill said, "because a man with $6 and a sick child should not be buying metalwork." Calvin walked out. By that afternoon, Quill knew what the purchases were for. Someone had seen Calvin marking post holes with the broken file, and the story moved through the valley the way all stories moved, carried by riders between ranches, repeated at the well, thickened with each telling. By sundown, Quill had the phrase ready. He said it to Beetle Crow when Beetle stopped for tobacco, and Beetle repeated it to a freighter, and the freighter said it to 2 ranch hands watering horses at the river crossing. Morrow's putting a sombrero on a coffin. It was cruel because it was efficient. The cabin was the coffin, small, dark, built for the dead. The shade canopy was the sombrero, laughable, decorative, a joke placed on top of a tragedy. The phrase carried everything the valley thought about Calvin's plan in 7 words, and once it existed, it was the only thing anyone said when his name came up. The ranch hands rode past Calvin's claim 2 days later and slowed their horses. One of them called out, "Planning to shoe the coffin next morrow? Maybe put a saddle on it?" The other laughed. Calvin was measuring a mesquite pole and did not look up. A freighter passing south said he had heard Calvin was building a house over a house and that the wind would carry the top one to Sonora before July. Quill said nothing more publicly. He did not need to. The phrase was doing his work, and Calvin understood, though he did not say it to anyone, that the mockery was not accidental cruelty. Quill needed Calvin to fail. If Calvin made the cabin livable, he might survive the summer, make the August payment, and keep the well. If Calvin became the fool of the valley, no one would hire him for wagon repair. No one would sell him materials on credit. No one would help him raise a beam, and the default would come as naturally as sunset. The social isolation was the real weapon. The heat could be fought. Loneliness could not. Calvin knelt in the dirt by the south post hole and drove the auger bit into the ground with a mallet. Mara watched from the doorway, her arms folded across her chest because even raising them took energy she did not have. He twisted the auger. The ground was hard, baked. packed with decades of sun and no rain. Each rotation gained half an inch. The post hole needed to be 4 feet deep, and the sun was directly overhead, and there were 6 holes to dig, and he was one man with 2 blistered hands and a daughter who could not help, and a valley that was already laughing. He twisted the auger again. The first post hole took a full day, 4 feet deep in ground that fought every inch. By the bottom of the hole, Calvin was lying on his stomach with his arm down the shaft, scraping loose earth into a bucket tied to a rope. His forearms were scraped raw from the edges. His palms, already blistered from the auger, had torn open on the left hand where the callus had not yet formed, and he wrapped them in strips cut from a flour sack that was too dirty to use for food. The second hole went slightly faster because the ground near the northeast corner held more gravel, which loosened easier than the packed clay to the south. He finished it by noon on the second day and sat in the shade of the cabin's east wall, the 11-inch strip that now felt like luxury, and drank water warm enough to taste of the barrel's wood. Mara brought him a piece of corn cake. She had baked it on a flat stone outside the cabin door because the inside was too hot for any task that involved standing near the roof. Calvin ate the corn cake and looked at the 2 holes and the 4 that remained, and the arithmetic of exhaustion settled over him. 2 holes in 2 days. 6 holes total. 3 more days at this rate, and then the posts, and then the beams, and then the cross pieces, and then the shade mat, and the monsoon wind could arrive any day after mid-June. The monsoon season did not negotiate. He cut the first post that evening. Mesquite from the river bottom, roughly 16 feet long, and thick enough at the base to resist the lateral force of wind against the canopy. Mesquite was the hardest wood available. Cutting it with a hand saw took 40 minutes per post, and the saw blade heated so thoroughly in the ambient air that Calvin had to pause and let it cool or risk warping the set of the teeth. He dragged the post back to the claim behind the mule, and the mule was the only living creature on the property that did not seem to mind the heat. The third hole broke his pick handle. He was 4 feet into the southwest corner, driving through a shelf of calcium hardite that rang like iron under the pick, and the handle snapped at the neck with a sound like a rifle shot. He stood in the hole holding 2 pieces of wood and no way to finish the digging. A new pick handle cost 75 cents at Quill's store, and buying anything from Quill meant adding to the ledger and hearing the total read aloud. He bought the handle. Quill read the total aloud. Calvin did not respond. By the 6th day, the first post stood. Calvin and the mule together could not lift a 16-foot mesquite pole into a 4-foot hole, so Calvin rigged a simple gin, a tripod of wagon timbers with a rope over the apex, and walked the post up hand over hand while the mule held tension on the baseline. The post dropped into the hole with a sound that shook the ground, and Calvin spent the next 2 hours setting it plumb with stone chalks and tamped earth, the way he had set wagon bolsters for years, patient, measured, a 1/4 inch at a time, 1 post standing, 5 to go. And above it, nothing but open sky and the promise of shade that did not yet exist. That night, Mara said, "Papa, it is still hot." Calvin said, "I know." She said, "Is the tall thing going to help?" He said, "Yes." And he was not certain. He was not certain at all. But the word came out solid because she needed it solid. And Calvin had learned years ago that the first audience for a carpenter's confidence is the person standing beneath what he has built. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see the risk, not the reason? The next morning, he woke before dawn and walked to the second post hole with the repaired pick and the auger and the strips of flour sack for his hands. The stars were still visible. The air was cool for the first time in 12 hours. Not cold, not comfortable, but cool enough that his skin was not actively burning. He had perhaps 3 hours before the sun took the cool away, and in those 3 hours he could dig another 2 feet, or cut another post, or haul another load of brush from the river. 3 hours of cool, then 12 of fire, then another brief mercy at the edges of the day. That was the rhythm, and every post hole, every beam, every lashing would have to fit inside those margins. He lifted the pick. Somewhere south along the wash, Alejandra Carrillo was already awake, mixing mud for a client's wall, working in the same narrow window of tolerable air. She did not know it yet, but she would be back at Calvin's claim within the week. Not to help, not yet, but to watch. Because what Calvin was building was either the most foolish thing she had seen a man attempt in the Sonoran desert, or the most important, and she could not tell which, and the not knowing pulled at her the way an unsound wall pulled at her hands until she had tested every joint. To the southwest, at Huaque, Tomas Anton was finishing a saguaro rib repair on a harvest camp shelter. He had not yet heard of Calvin Morrow. He had not yet seen a man try to do with timber what his people had done with mesquite and cholla for generations. When he did, it would not be the ambition that caught his attention. It would be the way Calvin sharpened a draw knife, the angle of the hand, the patience of the stroke, the knowledge in the wrist that said this man understands what wood can do. But that meeting was still days away. For now, Calvin dug alone in the dark, racing the sun, with 5 post holes unfinished and a frame that existed only in scratched dirt, and a daughter breathing hard through the wall of a cabin that was already beginning to warm. The thermometer read 89 degrees at dawn. By noon it would read 108. And the posts were not up, and the beams were not cut, and the shade did not exist, and July was coming. Tomas Anton did not introduce himself. He appeared. Calvin was trying to set the 3rd post alone. He had rigged the gin tripod again, walked the mesquite pole halfway up, and felt the base kick sideways in the hole because the bottom was not flat enough. The post twisted, the rope slipped 2 inches through his hands, and the pole swung wide like a compass needle looking for north. Calvin threw his weight against the rope and held it, but the post hung at a 30-degree angle with its base jammed against one side of the hole, and he could not push it vertical without releasing the rope, which would drop 16 feet of mesquite onto his head. He stood there, locked, muscles shaking, rope burning through the flour sack wraps on his palms, and a voice behind him said, "You are fighting the pole. Let the hole hold it." Calvin did not turn around. He could not. The voice said, "Bell the bottom, wider at the base than the mouth. The pole finds its seat and the dirt locks it." A hand appeared beside Calvin's hand on the rope, brown, thick-knuckled, scarred across the back. The hand took tension, and Calvin felt the weight have. Together they walked the post upright, and this time the base slid into the center of the hole because the man had kicked loose dirt into the low side while Calvin held the line. The post stood. Calvin let go of the rope and turned around. Tomas Antone was 58 years old, though he looked both older and younger depending on which part of his face you studied. His hands were old, seamed, dark, the nails thick from decades of gripping tools. His eyes were not old. They watched Calvin the way a man watches another man use a knife, checking the grip, the angle, the confidence of the stroke. He was Oodham from Huaque, a farmer, a woodworker, and a seasonal builder of saguaro harvest camps in the desert east of the Santa Cruz. He had built more shade structures than Calvin had built wagons, and he had come to Calvin's claim not out of charity, but out of the same curiosity that had pulled Alejandra. Something was happening here that was either very foolish or very interesting, and Tomas could not tell which from a distance. He looked at the post. He looked at the hole. He looked at the 2 posts already standing, and Calvin saw his mouth tighten. Those 2, Tomas said, pointing north, are straight, but they lean in. Calvin said they were plumb. He had checked with a weighted string. Plumb is for walls, Tomas said. These are not walls. These hold a roof that wind pushes, lean them out, 2 fingers width at the top. When the wind presses the canopy south, the posts tighten instead of folding. Calvin stared at the 2 posts he had spent 3 days setting. Tomas was telling him they were wrong, not crooked, not weak, wrong in their relationship to a force that had not arrived yet. I would have to reset them, Calvin said. Yes. Calvin looked at the sky. The sun was past noon. The temperature inside the cabin had climbed past 105. Mara was lying on the floor with a wet rag that was already dry. Resetting 2 posts meant digging out the tamped earth, lifting the poles, re-angling the holes, and starting the whole process from the beginning. It meant losing 2 days he did not have. Tomas said, "You want shade that stays, or you want shade that falls when you need it most." Calvin pulled the first post that afternoon. Tomas did not offer to stay. He stayed. He did not announce a partnership or explain his reasons. He arrived the next morning with a hand adze, a coil of yucca fiber rope, and a water gourd, and he began working on the 4th post hole without asking which corner it belonged to. He studied Calvin's dirt drawing, studied the cabin, studied the angle of the morning sun, and dug where the drawing said to dig. Over the next 5 days, Calvin learned more about desert building than he had learned about any single craft in his life, and every lesson came through Tomas's hands rather than his words. Post setting. Tomas showed Calvin how to bell the bottom of each hole, wider at the base than the mouth, shaped like an upside-down bell, so the post could seat itself in the center of gravity. Stone chocks went at opposing corners, not packed uniformly, so the post could absorb small movements without cracking the earth collar. Damp earth was tamped in thumb-thick layers. Each one dried slightly before the next was added, creating rings of compression rather than one solid pack that might shift as a unit. The slight outward rake, 2 fingers width per 12 feet, meant that lateral wind pressure would drive the posts tighter into the ground rather than levering them loose. Desert lashing. Rawhide soaked in water, wrapped wet around the joint, and left to dry in the sun. As the moisture left, the hide contracted, pulling the joint so tight that Calvin could hang his full weight from a crossbeam tied with 3 wraps of dried rawhide. Yucca fiber went where rawhide was too precious to waste, interior joints, secondary braces, the places where adjustment might be needed later. Iron straps, which cost money, were saved for the 4 windward corners where failure meant the whole structure pivoting and tearing loose. Shade density. This was the lesson Calvin had needed and could not have invented. The shade canopy was not a roof. It was not meant to be waterproof. It was a screen, thick enough to break direct sunlight before it reached the cabin, but loose enough in weave to let hot air rise through and escape. Tomas layered the mat the way his people layered harvest camp shelters. First, a frame of ocotillo wands laid parallel at hand-width spacing, then a crossing layer of dead saguaro ribs, then mesquite brush packed into the grid, then a top layer of lighter material, willow, dried grass, whatever could be replaced after storms, that filled the remaining gaps. The finished mat, when Calvin looked up through it from below, showed small points of sky. Not enough sky to let meaningful sun through, just enough gaps to let trapped heat escape upward. A solid roof fights the wind, Tomas said. A breathing roof lets the wind pass through. A solid roof traps the hot air above the cabin and pushes it back down. A breathing roof lets it leave. Calvin tested the concept on a small section. He held a flat board in the sun for 5 minutes, then moved it under the mat. In the shade, the board stopped heating. Above the mat, heat radiated upward through the gaps, and when Calvin held his hand above the canopy, he could feel the warmth leaving. Tomas watched him test it and did something Calvin had not expected. He nodded. It was a small thing, a nod. But Tomas did not nod at ideas. He nodded at evidence. And in that nod, Calvin understood that the man who had corrected his post angles and replaced his lashing technique and redesigned his hole profiles had just confirmed that the principle was sound. The carpenter from Ohio had seen something real at San Xavier, and the builder from WAC had just told him so without saying a word. Construction ran as measurable progress, and the audience should feel each mark. Day 7. 3 posts standing, angled correctly, chalked and tamped. Calvin's palms had stopped bleeding and started building calluses thick as boot leather. Mara ate corn broth and slept in the cabin through the hottest hours because there was nowhere else, and Calvin worked around the building like a man circling a furnace, always moving to stay in whatever strip of shade the standing posts cast as the sun moved. Day 9. Quill refused further credit. Calvin walked into the store to buy 4 pounds of rawhide for the beam lashings, and Quill set his pencil down and said, "Your account is closed until the August payment." Calvin had known this was coming. He had $7.40 remaining. The rawhide cost $1.20. He paid in coin and carried the hide out without speaking, and Quill watched him go and made a note in the ledger. Day 10. The north beam went up. Calvin and Tomas used a block and tackle rig borrowed from a freighter who owed Tomas a favor from a shared harvest season. The beam was a salvaged wagon timber, white oak, dense, heavy enough that Calvin could not lift one end alone. They hoisted it to the top of the north posts with the tackle and set it into the notches Calvin had cut the night before by lantern light. The notches were tight. The beam seated with a sound like a door closing, and for the first time the structure had horizontal weight connecting vertical posts, and it looked like something rather than nothing. Day 12. Mara fainted. She had been carrying water from the well to the mixing spot, where Calvin and Tomas soaked rawhide, and the 40-foot walk in open sun collapsed her legs. Calvin found her on her side in the dirt, with the water bucket spilled beside her, and her skin so hot and dry that his hand came away feeling scorched. He carried her inside, wet every remaining cloth, and spent 2 hours dripping water across her wrists and neck, while Tomas continued working outside alone. When Mara's temperature dropped enough for her to open her eyes, she said, "I dropped the water." Calvin said, "I know." She said, "I am sorry." He held her hand and did not say what he was thinking, which was that the water she had dropped was a quarter of the day's well yield, and the rawhide would not soak properly without it, and the south beam could not go up until the lashings were ready, and every hour lost was an hour closer to the monsoon. He did not say it because she was 8 years old, and she had tried to help, and the desert had punished her for it. Day 14. Help arrived that was not charity. Tomas brought 2 younger relatives, men in their 20s whose names Calvin learned and used, Akosi, for one afternoon. They came not because Calvin needed saving, but because Tomas had told them that the carpenter from Ohio understood joints, respected materials, and listened when corrected. That description, among builders, was currency. The 2 men helped raise the south beam and the center crosspiece in 4 hours of coordinated work, and when they left, the canopy frame stood complete and skeleton. 6 posts, 4 perimeter beams, 2 center supports, and a grid of crosspieces ready to receive the shade mat. 6 posts, not 4. That change came from Alejandra. She had returned on day 11, not to help, but to look. She walked the frame, measured the span between the corner posts with her eye. She did not need a tape. She had been measuring walls with her body for 15 years, and said, 24 feet unsupported will sag in the center. The brush will pool there. Rain will collect. The center will become the heaviest point and the weakest joint at the same time. Calvin added 2 center side posts. Alejandra did not stay, but she did something before leaving that surprised him. She brought a half bucket of lime and said, whitewash the cabin roof beneath the shade. If any light gets through the mat, the white surface will reflect it instead of absorbing it. It costs you nothing but an afternoon. Calvin whitewashed the cabin roof the next morning. Standing on the beams, he could feel the difference already. The shade frame blocked most of the sky above him, and the boards beneath his feet were warm rather than scalding. Not cool, not yet. The mat was not in place, but the temperature of the roof surface in the shade of the unfinished frame was lower than it had been at any point since his arrival, and the drop was noticeable enough that when he climbed down and checked the thermometer inside the cabin, it read 98 degrees at 1 in the afternoon. That was still hot, but it was 9 degrees lower than the same hour the week before, and the mat was not even up yet. Setbacks came in clusters, the way desert trouble always comes, not one at a time, but stacked. A dust devil crossed the claim on day 15 and scattered the first section of brush mat Calvin and Tomas had laid across the North Cross pieces. The branches flew 30 yards. Some broke. Some landed in the mesquite scrub and had to be retrieved by hand, reaching into thorns. Calvin lost half a day's progress and all of the willow poles he had hauled from the river bottom the morning before. On day 16, the east beam slipped 6 inches in its notch during a gust. The rawhide lashing had not dried completely. Calvin had rushed it, and the leather stretched under the lateral force just enough for the beam to slide. Tomas found the failure before Calvin did, and he did not soften it. He unwrapped the lashing, held it up, and said, "Wet. You tied this wet because you wanted to move fast." He was not angry. He stated it the way a man states that rain is falling. Calvin relashed the joint and added a yucca fiber safety wrap beneath the rawhide, and the beam held. On day 17, Quill made his move. He walked to the claim in the middle of the afternoon, a walk Quill would not normally make because Quill avoided physical discomfort the way fire avoids water, and he offered Calvin a deal. He would forgive $20 of the debt. He would release the claim paper. He would write Calvin a clean receipt. All Calvin had to do was sign over the well and move into town until September. Calvin was on the frame tying brush. Sweat ran from his chin onto the crossbeam. His shirt was soaked through and drying simultaneously, leaving white salt lines across the back. Morrow was inside. The thermometer read 104. "Think of the girl," Quill said. He was standing in the sun because the shade did not extend to where he stood, and his discomfort was visible in the way he shifted from foot to foot. "You are building a folly, Calvin, a folly held up with sticks and Indian knots, and when it comes down, you will have nothing, not the shade, not the money, not the time. I am offering you a way out before it falls." Calvin looked down at him. "The August payment is $20, which you cannot make. I have not missed it yet. You will, and when you do, I take the well anyway. This way the girl gets a roof that does not collapse." Tomas, sitting on the north beam with a knife in his hand, trimming a saguaro rib, did not look up. He continued trimming. The sound of the knife on the rib was the only sound for 10 seconds. Calvin said, "I will make the payment." Quill looked at the frame, the posts, the beams, the half-finished mat-e, and his expression was the expression of a man watching money burn. He turned and walked back toward Tucson without speaking again. That evening, after Quill left, Beetle Crow rode past on his way south. He stopped and studied the frame from horseback. He did not dismount. He studied the posts, the lashings, the angle of the beams. He studied the half-covered north section where brush and saguaro ribs cast broken shade across the cabin roof. "Taller than I expected," Beetle said. "The frame is not bad. I've seen worse from builders who were not working alone." He paused. "But it is a kite, Calvin. A kite 12 feet in the air held together with string and stubbornness. When the monsoon wind hits, and it will hit because it always hits, that canopy will be the biggest thing standing between here and Tucson with nothing behind it but open valley. Wind will see it like a wall." Calvin said, "The mat breathes." "The mat breathes in a calm. What about a gust?" Calvin did not answer because he did not know. The wind gap theory was Tomas's, and Calvin trusted it, but trust is not the same as proof. Proof required the wind. Beetle touched his hat brim and rode south, and Calvin, standing in the incomplete shade of a half-finished structure that might fly apart in the first real storm, felt the doubt crawl through his chest the way heat crawled through the cabin walls. Slow, steady, and impossible to keep out. The canopy was complete enough to cast shade by the last days of June. Not finished. The west section still had gaps in the brush layer where ocotillo wands had not been woven tightly enough, and the south face lacked the diagonal braces Tomas had been insisting on for a week. But the shade was down. The sun that had hammered the cabin roof since Amos built it now struck the canopy 4 feet above and spent its energy there, heating brush and saguaro ribs and mesquite rails that had open air beneath them and sky above. The heat rose, passed through the loose weave, and vanished into the atmosphere. The cabin roof sat in shade. Calvin hung one thermometer inside the cabin and another outside under the eave where the sun used to strike the wall directly. At noon, he checked both. The shaded wall read 17 degrees lower than the same wall had read the week before the canopy went up. Inside the cabin, the afternoon temperature held at 95 instead of climbing past 107. He touched the roof boards at noon. His hand stayed flat. He did not jerk it away. That night, for the first time since arriving, Mara slept until midnight without waking. The cabin still held warmth. The timber walls had not changed, but the rate of heat entry had dropped so sharply that the interior temperature peaked lower and began cooling earlier. By midnight, the inside air was tolerable. By 2 in the morning, it was close to comfortable. Mara lay on her blanket with her hands open at her sides, not curled against her chest, not pressing her face to the floor. Calvin sat in the doorway and watched her breathe. 12 degrees was the difference. 12 degrees between a child who slept and a child who suffered. But proof was not validation. Beetle came by the next morning, looked at the thermometer, and said, "Calm air, no wind. This tells you nothing about what happens when the sky moves." He was not wrong. The June days had been still and brutal, the kind of heat that sits on the land like a hand pressing down. The monsoon was different. The monsoon brought wind before it brought rain, outflow boundaries, haboobs, gusts that could flatten tents and roll wagons. The canopy had been built in still air. It had not yet met moving air. Alejandra saw the same danger. She walked the south face and put her hand against the brush mat and pushed. It flexed. "This side faces the valley," she said. "The monsoon comes from the south and the east. Your longest unsupported span faces the wind." She pointed to the gap where the diagonal braces should have gone. "If you do not brace this, the first gust will bow the mat inward, pull the lashing at the top, and the south beam will lift off the posts." Tomas returned that afternoon. He had been at Waike for 2 days, tending his own fields, and he came back carrying a bundle of yucca fiber and a look that said he already knew what Alejandra had told Calvin. The diagonal braces went up that evening, mesquite poles cut at angles and lashed from post base to beam top in an X pattern on the south and east faces. Tomas also did something Calvin would not have thought to do. He cut 2 gaps in the brush mat on the south face, each about 2 feet wide, and left them open. Calvin said, "That lets sun through." Tomas said, "It lets wind through. A small gap in the shade is nothing. A solid wall of brush and a gust is everything. The wind needs a place to go. Give it one, and it passes. Deny it, and it takes the whole roof to make its own." He called them sacrificial gaps. The shade lost 2 narrow strips of coverage. The structure gained the ability to survive the thing that would otherwise destroy it. Quill escalated. He filed notice at the courthouse in Tucson that Calvin's August payment was due on the 1st. He also withheld a small medicine order, quinine and camphor, that Calvin had requested through the store's supply run from a Tucson pharmacy, claiming that Calvin's account was unsettled and that the pharmacy would not release goods against disputed credit. Whether that was true or whether Quill had simply not placed the order, Calvin could not know. But Mara's cough had returned with the dust from the bracework, and without the quinine, Calvin had only willow bark tea and wet cloths. The human countdown tightened. Calvin needed Mara healthy enough to survive the heat. He needed the canopy complete enough to survive the wind. He needed $20 by August 1st for a man who was actively working to ensure he did not have it. 3 deadlines. 3 threats. 1 man with blistered hands standing under an unfinished shade structure that had not yet been tested by the only thing that mattered. July pressed forward. The crisis announced itself 3 days before it arrived. The air changed first. The dry clarity that had defined June, the sky so blue it looked painted, the mountains so sharp against the horizon they could cut, gave way to a milky haze. Moisture pushed north from the Gulf. The humidity climbed, and with it the temperature became heavier. 102 degrees in dry air was brutal. 102 degrees in humid air was suffocating. The sweat that had evaporated fast enough to cool Calvin's skin in June now sat on him like oil. His shirt clung. His lungs worked harder. Mara's cough deepened. Tomas read the sky the way Calvin read wood grain. He stood outside the canopy on the morning of the 2nd day and looked south and said, 2 days, maybe 1. The dust comes first, then the wind, then the rain if we're fortunate. Calvin asked what he meant by fortunate. Rain cools the air. Wind without rain is just force. By afternoon, animals had gone quiet. The birds that normally chattered in the mesquite along the wash were silent. The lizards that ran across the cabin walls at dawn had vanished. A stillness pressed down on the valley, the kind of stillness that is not peace but pressure, the atmosphere holding its breath before exhaling. Calvin checked the canopy. The north and east sections were solid, brush woven tight, lashings dried hard, diagonal braces locked. The south section, the longest face, the one aimed at the valley, the one Alejandra had warned him about, had the diagonal braces and the sacrificial gaps, but the brush layer was thinner than the other faces because Calvin had run out of ocotillo wands and had not had time to cut more. He could see light through it in places he should not have been able to see light. He spent the day gathering whatever brush he could find within walking distance, dead creosote branches, dried grass bundles, scraps of willow from the river. He wove them into the south mat by hand, working from the top of the frame, lying across the crossbeams with his arms through the weave. tucking material into gaps while the sun beat on his back and the humidity turned his clothing into a compress. Tomas worked beside him. They did not talk about what was coming. They worked. Alejandra arrived at sundown. She had walked from her place along the wash, carrying nothing but a clay jug of water and a length of braided rawhide. She looked at the sky, looked at the canopy, and looked at Calvin. "The south mat is too thin in the middle section," she said. "I know." "Can you finish it tonight?" "No." She held out the braided rawhide. "Then tie the middle section twice. If the brush lifts, the frame must hold." Calvin took the rawhide. Alejandra did not leave. She sat near the cabin door with Mara and wet a cloth for the girl's forehead, and Calvin understood that she had come not to help with the frame, but to be present for whatever happened next. The dust hit at noon. It came from the south, a brown wall visible for 15 minutes before it arrived, moving across the valley floor like a tide of earth rising off the ground. The sky above it was purple-black. Lightning flashed inside the cloud, but produced no sound yet, too far for thunder, close enough for light. Calvin was on the ground when it hit. The first gust struck the south face of the canopy with a sound like a sail snapping taut on a ship. The brush mat bowed inward. The south posts groaned. The rawhide lashings on the windward corner made a sound like a pistol crack. The sharp, percussive snap of dried hide absorbing more force than it was designed for. Inside the cabin, Mara screamed, not from pain, from the sound. The crack was loud enough to be mistaken for breaking timber, and an 8-year-old girl in a dark room heard it as the beginning of collapse. Alejandra took Mara into the northeast corner of the cabin, the corner farthest from the south wall, the corner where the structure above was strongest and the wind pressure lowest. She pressed Mara against the wall and held her there, and her voice was calm and steady. "The posts are in the ground. The posts are in the ground. Listen to me, not to the wind. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether this roof is shelter or a trap." Calvin ran to the south face. The brush mat was flexing like a living thing, bowing in with each gust and springing back in the lulls. Through the sacrificial gaps, wind poured like water through a sluice, visible as streams of dust, narrow and fast, roaring through the 2-foot openings and spending their force on the open air behind the canopy. Tomas had been right. Without those gaps, the entire south mat would have been a wall, and the wind would have treated it like one. But the middle section, the section Calvin had patched with thin brush, the section Alejandra had told him to double tie, was lifting. The brush was not dense enough to resist the force, and it was pulling away from the cross beams in the center, opening a ragged hole that flapped and tore wider with each gust. If the hole grew large enough, the wind would enter the canopy from below and push upward, and the entire structure would become a wing. Calvin grabbed rope, the last coil of maguey fiber he owned, and climbed the frame. This was insanity, and he knew it. The structure was shaking. The crossbeams vibrated under his hands. Dust filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. He could not see clearly. He climbed by feel, the way he had climbed wagon frames in rainstorms during his freight years, trusting his hands more than his vision. He reached the mat and lay flat across 2 crossbeams with his legs hooked around a third. The wind hit him in gusts that tried to slide him sideways. He reached into the tear and pulled the loose brush back into place and held it with one hand while the other hand fed rope through the weave and around the crossbeam below. He tied it blind. He tied it the way Tomas had taught him. Wrap, cross, tighten, wet the knot with spit because there was no water up here and saliva was the closest thing to moisture. The knot would hold until it dried and shrank, and by then either the storm would be over or nothing would matter. The first repair held. The second gust hit harder. The sound changed. The groaning of the post became deeper. The south beam shifted, not much, a half inch, maybe less. But Calvin felt it through the cross beams the way a carpenter feels a floor settle beneath a heavy load. The beam was alive with force. Every gust pushed south to north, and the beam absorbed it and transferred it to the posts, and the posts transferred it to the ground, and the ground held because Tomas had set those posts in belled holes with stone chocks and tamped earth, and a 2-finger outward rake that meant the wind was driving the posts tighter instead of pulling them loose. The design was working, not easily, not gracefully. It was working the way a wagon works on a mountain road, straining, flexing, making sounds that terrify the passengers while the joints do exactly what they were built to do. Then the complicating emergency arrived. A young ranch hand named Ned Bell had been sleeping in an unshaded board shed a quarter-mile east, guarding a small cattle pen for one of the larger ranches. The shed had no canopy, no shade, no ventilation, a plank box smaller than Calvin's cabin, and Ned had been inside it when the dust hit. He stumbled out into the storm, disoriented, and walked toward the only structure visible through the brown air, Calvin's canopy, which stood 12 feet above the landscape and was the tallest thing between the claim and the river. Beetle Crow found him. Beetle had ridden toward Calvin's claim expecting to witness the collapse, expecting to confirm what he had told Calvin about kites and string, and instead he found Ned Bell on his knees in the dirt 50 yards from the canopy, retching, skin burning to the touch, unable to stand. Beetle dismounted, lifted Ned across the horse, and brought him to the cabin. Alejandra met them at the door. She took one look at Ned, flushed, dry, not sweating despite the heat, pupils uneven, and pointed to the floor beside Mara. Inside, water on his neck, wet cloths on his wrists, keep him in the shade. Beetle carried Ned inside and laid him on the floor. The cabin was warm, but not killing. The shade canopy above was shaking, groaning, losing a panel of brush on the west face, but the roof beneath it was not radiating. The walls were not hot to the touch. The air inside was bearable, not comfortable. 100 degrees, maybe 98 times some, but bearable. Ned lay on the packed earth, and his breathing slowed, and the wet cloths Alejandra placed on his wrists and neck stayed cool longer than they would have in any unshaded structure within 2 miles. Beetle stood in the cabin doorway and looked up at the canopy. A full gust hit while he watched. The south mat bowed. The sacrificial gaps screamed with dust. 2 brush panels tore free and flew north. The frame shook and held. He looked at the posts. Solid. The outward rake was visible in the lean, the posts pressed tighter into their holes with every gust. He looked at the lashings on the nearest windward corner, dried rawhide over iron straps, the joint turning white with tension but not breaking. He looked at the cross beams flexing, absorbing force, transferring it to the posts. He said nothing. He turned and began wetting cloths for Ned. Quill arrived 20 minutes later, having walked from his store through the dust because his horse would not face the wind. He stood outside the canopy and shouted at Beetle through the roar. Calvin was endangering people by bringing them into an unstable structure. The canopy was failing. Panels were flying. Anyone underneath was at risk. Beetle looked at Quill standing in the open sun and dirt and wind, and then looked at Ned Bell, lying in the shaded cabin, breathing normally, and said, "Get inside or get water. I do not need a third option from you." Quill did not get inside. He did not get water. He stood in the wind for another 2 minutes, and then walked back toward Tucson, leaning into the gusts like a man climbing a hill. Above them, Calvin clung to the crossbeam. The second wave of the storm was arriving, the real wind behind the dust wall, the outflow boundary that pushed cold air from a distant thunderstorm downward and outward across the valley. The temperature dropped, not by much, 3 degrees, maybe 5 days, but the wind speed doubled, and the canopy was no longer groaning. It was roaring. The frame vibrated at a frequency Calvin could feel in his ribs. He looked down through the mat. 12 feet below, through the 4-foot gap between the canopy and the cabin roof, he could see the whitewash boards of the roof he had painted with Alejandra's lime. They were dry. They were cool enough that no heat shimmered above them. The gap was working. Hot air rose through the loose weave of the mat and escaped. Cool air, or at least cooler air, air that was not superheated by a sun-struck surface, circulated through the gap and around the cabin walls. 3 things were happening simultaneously, and the script must show all 3 through Calvin's eyes and hands. The canopy intercepted the sun. Even through the dust, even through the cloud cover that the storm brought, the canopy caught what radiation reached it and absorbed it 4 feet above the cabin. The cabin roof was in shade. The 4-foot gap let the trapped air move. Hot air rose through the mat. Cooler air replaced it from the sides. There was no trapping, no stove effect, no box holding heat against the people below. The separate posts kept the canopy's movement away from the cabin. The frame shook, the beams flexed, the mat tore in places, but the cabin walls did not move. The structure above danced in the wind while the structure below sat still because they were not connected. The canopy was a rider on its own horse, and the cabin was the ground. The peak of the storm lasted 45 minutes. Calvin lay on the crossbeam for all of it, tying brush, retying knots, watching the sacrificial gaps pass wind through like a screen passes water. 2 more brush panels tore free on the south face. The west face lost a section of willow, but the frame held. The posts held. The beams held. The lashings held. Then the rain came. It came in sheets so thick Calvin could not see the cabin below him. The first drops hit the brush mat and ran through. The mat was not waterproof, and Tomas had never intended it to be. Water poured through the weave and struck the whitewashed cabin roof and ran off the shallow slope into the dirt. But the rain also added weight. Water collected in the denser sections of the brush where the weave was tightest, and those sections sagged. The center crossbeam bowed under the pooling weight. Calvin remembered Alejandra's warning. The center will become the heaviest point and the weakest joint. He remembered Tomas's lesson. When something goes wrong, let part of it go to save the rest. He drew his knife and cut 2 drain channels through the brush mat, long slits 4 inches wide, running from the pooling center to the edges. Water poured through the slits and off the canopy. The weight released. The center beam straightened. The mat looked worse, ragged, torn, scarred with cuts, but it was still there, and the frame beneath it was still standing, and the cabin beneath the frame was still dry inside. The rain lasted 20 minutes. The wind dropped with it. The dust settled. The sky lightened from black to brown to the pale white of exhaustion. Calvin climbed down from the frame. His hands were raw. His arms shook. His shirt was torn where a crossbeam had caught it. He had a gash on his right forearm where the knife had slipped during the drain cuts, shallow but bleeding, red mixed with rain. He walked into the cabin. Mara was asleep. Alejandra sat beside her with a wet cloth in her hand, no longer needed. Beetle crouched next to Ned Bell, who was conscious and drinking from a cup. The thermometer on the wall read 97 degrees. 97. during a storm that had driven a healthy young man to the ground from heat exposure in an unshaded shed. 97 inside a timber cabin that everyone in the valley had said would kill its occupants. 97 beneath a canopy that Quill had called a folly, and Beetle had called a kite, and Alejandra had called a sail. Beetle looked at the thermometer. He looked at Ned Bell, breathing normally on the floor. He looked at Calvin, standing in the doorway with blood on his arm and dust in his teeth, and the expression of a man who had just been told something he already knew but had not been allowed to believe. Beetle said, "The shed where the boy was sleeping. What do you think the temperature was in there?" Calvin said, "Without shade? On those boards? 125. Maybe 130 against the wall." Beetle looked at the thermometer again. 97. He said nothing else. He wrung out the cloth, laid it across Ned's forehead, and the silence in the cabin was the loudest thing Calvin had heard since the storm began. Outside, the canopy dripped. 3 brush panels were gone. 1 sacrificial gap had widened to 4 feet. The south diagonal brace had a crack running from the lashing down 6 inches. The west mat sagged. The frame stood. The posts stood. The shade, battered, torn, imperfect, held its position 4 feet above a cabin roof that was cool enough to touch. Calvin leaned against the doorframe. Mara breathed slow and steady on the floor. The rain ticked against the brush mat overhead, gentle now, the last drops of a storm that had tested everything and broken only the parts designed to break. The canopy was damaged. Calvin still owed Quill. The August payment was 12 days away. The monsoon season was not over. Nothing was solved. But the shade held. The shade held. The morning after the storm, Calvin repaired the canopy alone. Tomas had gone back to Waikei before the dust hit. His own fields needed tending, his own structures needed checking, and he would not return for 3 days. Alejandra left at first light with Ned Bell, who could walk but not steadily, guiding him toward the ranch where someone could put him on a horse. Beetle had ridden out during the night without saying goodbye or anything else. Calvin climbed the frame at dawn. The damage was specific and manageable. 3 brush panels torn from the south mat, 1 sacrificial gap widened beyond usefulness, a 6-inch crack in the south diagonal brace, and sagging across the west section where rain had pooled before his drain cuts released it. The posts were solid. The beams had not shifted. The lashings, except for 1 rawhide wrap on the southeast corner that had stretched and needed retying, were intact. He worked through the morning replacing brush, retying knots, cutting a splint for the cracked brace from a mesquite branch, and lashing it alongside the break so the 2 pieces shared the load. By noon, the canopy looked rough, patched, scarred, visibly tested, but it cast shade across the full cabin roof, and the sacrificial gaps were back to their designed width. He checked the thermometer at 1 in the afternoon. 96 degrees inside. The day was hot, but not as hot as the week before the storm, because the monsoon moisture had shifted the air, and the clouds that followed the outflow boundary filtered some of the direct sun. Still, 96 in a timber cabin in July, south of Tucson, was a number that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. Calvin did not celebrate. He sat on the cabin step and ate cold corn cake and drank warm water and looked at the canopy the way a man looks at a bridge he has just crossed in a flood, not with pride, but with the quiet knowledge that it held, and the quieter knowledge that the next flood might be worse. The question in the valley had changed. Before the storm, the question was whether Calvin was a fool. After the storm, the question was whether Calvin was lucky. Beetle Crow returned 4 days later. He did not ride past this time. He dismounted, tied his horse to the mesquite post near the well, and walked the full perimeter of the canopy the way he had walked the cabin on his first visit, slowly touching things, studying joints, pressing his hand against surfaces to test temperature. He put his hand on the south wall of the cabin, the wall that had been too hot to touch on his first visit. His hand stayed. He looked at the canopy above, then at the wall, then at the gap between them where air moved in a faint current, carrying heat up and away. He climbed 2 rungs of Calvin's ladder and looked at the cabin roof from above. The whitewashed boards sitting in shade, dry, cool enough that a beetle was walking across them without lifting its legs from the heat. He climbed down. "I was wrong about the sail," Beetle said. "He said it the way a man confesses a debt, not willingly, but because the ledger demands it. You did not build a roof. You built a shadow with bones." He paused. He was not a man who enjoyed the next sentence, but he said it. "How far apart are the posts?" Calvin told him. 8 feet on the long sides, 10 on the short sides, with the 2 center posts splitting the span. 4 feet deep, belled at the bottom, raked outward 2 fingers' width at the top. Beetle repeated the numbers as if tasting them. He asked about the lashings. Calvin showed him. Rawhide for the windward joints, yucca fiber for the interior, iron straps only at the 4 corners. Beetle tested a lashing with his thumb, pressing hard. It did not give. "The gaps," Beetle said, pointing at the sacrificial openings in the south mat. "Those are not damage." "No, they are designed." Beetle looked at the gaps for a long time. Wind passed through them while he watched. A gentle gust, nothing like the storm, but enough to show the principle. The brush mat on either side of the gap stayed still. The air moved through the openings and continued north, and the canopy absorbed nothing. "Who taught you that?" Beetle asked. "Tomas Antone." Beetle nodded. He did not ask who Tomas was. He knew. "The Oasis have been building shade since before my grandfather was born," he said. "I should have thought of that before telling you it could not work." He did not shake Calvin's hand. He did not apologize for calling the cabin a slow oven or the canopy a kite. He mounted his horse and said, "I have a bunkhouse wall that faces west. It cooks the men until midnight. Could you build something like this against one wall? Not the whole building, just the west face." Calvin said he could. Beetle rode north, and Calvin stood beside the well and realized that the authority who had told him the cabin would kill his daughter had just asked for his help. Alejandra's conversion was different. She did not confess error because she had not been entirely wrong. The sail problem she had identified was real. The storm had torn 3 panels and cracked a brace. Her warning about the center span had led to the 2 extra posts that kept the canopy from sagging fatally when rain pooled. She had contributed lime that made the cabin roof reflective. Her skepticism had been the kind that improves rather than destroys. She came back 5 days after the storm, not to inspect but to compare. She brought her own thermometer, a small glass tube she used to test adobe curing temperatures. And she hung it inside her own workroom, an adobe structure with thick walls, a deep porch, and a proper desert design. Then she walked to Calvin's cabin and read his thermometer. Her adobe room at 2 in the afternoon, 91 degrees. Calvin's timber cabin under the Ramada, 95. 4 degrees. Her building, designed correctly for the desert, with mass walls and thermal lag and a shaded porch, was only 4 degrees cooler than a plank shack built by a dead man who did not know how desert heat worked. Alejandra held both thermometers and said nothing for a long time. "The Ramada is not replacing the adobe," she said finally. "The adobe is still better, but the Ramada is protecting the timber from ever becoming a heat source. You are not cooling the house. You are preventing the house from heating itself." Calvin said, "Yes, that is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected it to be cooler inside than outside. I expected magic. This is not magic. This is interception." She said the word the way Calvin imagined a doctor would say it, precisely as a diagnosis. The shade intercepted the sun. It did not cool, it prevented. She asked to see the lashing technique. Calvin showed her Tomas's method, the rawhide soaked, wrapped, dried tight. She tested the joint with both hands. Her fingers, strong from years of shaping mud and lifting forms, could not move it. "I want one of these over my work court," she said. "Not for the room. The room is adobe. But the court is open, and I cannot mix mud after 10 in the morning because the sun makes the water evaporate before it bonds." Calvin said, "I will build it." "I will help," she said. "You cannot mix adobe, and I cannot cut mesquite. That is the arrangement." She left. She did not smile. Alejandra did not smile when she was thinking, and she was thinking hard. And what she was thinking was the thing she would not say for another 2 months. That the carpenter who had arrived in the desert knowing nothing about heat had learned something in 6 weeks that most builders never learned at all. Not the technique, but the question. Calvin had asked why the house was hot instead of asking how to make it cool. And the difference between those two questions was the difference between fighting the sun and stepping out of its way. Community members began arriving with questions inside the first week after the storm. A woman named Esaren, Petra Ruiz Bex, came first. She lived 2 miles south with 3 children in an adobe house that was well built except for the flat roof, which had been repaired with salvaged timber after a beam collapse. The timber section heated like Calvin's original cabin, and her youngest son slept directly beneath it. She had heard about the canopy from Alejandra. She did not ask whether it worked. She asked how deep the post holes needed to be. Calvin showed her. He did not lecture. He took her to the southeast post, crouched beside it, and pointed into the gap between the post and the earth collar where the tamping layers were visible. 4 feet deep, wider at the bottom than the top, stone chocks at opposing corners, damp earth, tamped thumb thick, each layer dried before the next. Petra looked at the post hole the way Alejandra looked at a wall, reading it. "What about the angle?" she asked. 2 fingers width outward at the top. Wind pushes the post tighter instead of pulling it out. "And if I only need to shade one section of roof, not the whole house?" Calvin thought about it. A partial canopy, shading only the timber repair section, would be smaller and lighter. Fewer posts, shorter span, less wind exposure. "It still needs the gap," he said. "The gap between the shade and the roof is where the heat goes. Without the gap, you're just putting a second roof on top of the first and trapping hot air between them." Petra nodded and left. She returned 3 days later with her eldest son and 2 posts she had already cut, asking Calvin to check the wood before she dug. A blacksmith named Spat Ronaldo Vega Staxic came next. He worked in an open-sided forge shed that channeled afternoon sun directly onto his quenching trough, heating the water he needed cold. He wanted shade over the west face of the shed. Calvin walked the site with him and realized the application was simpler than a house canopy. 3 posts, 1 crossbeam, a sloped mat angled to block the western sun, while leaving the north and south open for ventilation. A rancher sent a hand to ask whether a shade frame could cover a water trough to slow evaporation. Calvin said yes, and the design was nearly the same as the forge shade, a small, angled canopy that blocked direct sun without enclosing the trough. Each conversation taught Calvin something he had not realized. The principle adapted. Not every application was a 24-foot canopy over a whole cabin. Some were small, some were partial, some shaded a wall, a workspace, a trough, a sleeping area. The core was always the same: intercept the sun before it touches the surface, keep a gap for hot air to escape, do not enclose. But the shape changed with each need. Calvin began to teach the way Thomas had taught him, through hands and demonstration, not through explanation. He put a flat board in the sun, another under the Ramada, and asked visitors to hold both. The difference was immediate, physical, undeniable. He did not argue. He showed. When Quill heard that people were visiting Calvin's claim, he did not attack the canopy. He attacked the source. He told customers at his store that the shade design was Indian work and that Calvin was teaching oasis tricks as if they were his own invention. The accusation was calculated. In the territory in 1879, crediting oasis knowledge was complicated. Some settlers respected it, others dismissed it. Quill was counting on the dismissal. Calvin addressed it directly the next time someone asked. A freighter named George Lott said, "Quill says this is native work and you are passing it off." Calvin said, "The Ramada is oasis. My people did not build it. A man named Thomas Antone taught me how the shade works and how to set the posts and how to lash the joints. What I did was put it over a timber cabin instead of over an open work court. The idea is not mine. The application is." George Lott looked at the canopy, looked at Calvin, and said, "Can Thomas build one of these for the freight station?" Calvin said, "Ask him yourself. He is the better builder." That answer traveled faster than Quill's accusation, because honesty is lighter than gossip and moves on fewer legs. Thomas returned to the claim on a Tuesday in the second week of July, riding a mule loaded with yucca fiber and 2 bundles of saguaro ribs. He had heard about the storm. He had heard about Ned Bell. He had heard about Beetle's conversion and Alejandra's comparison and the visitors with questions. He did not comment on any of it. He walked the canopy the way Beetle had, touching lashings and testing joints, but his inspection was different. Beetle had been checking whether the structure would stand. Thomas was checking whether it had learned. He found the splinted brace on the south diagonal and examined it. Calvin had lashed the splint with yucca fiber, using the crossing pattern Thomas had taught him, but adding a second layer of wraps above and below the breakpoint. Thomas pressed the splice with both thumbs. "Yours," he said. "I did not have anyone to ask." Thomas looked at him. "That is when you learn whether you listened." He stayed for 3 days. During those 3 days, the relationship changed. Thomas no longer corrected Calvin's work from a position of full authority. He suggested. He asked questions. He proposed alternatives and waited for Calvin to choose between them. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas was no longer teaching a student. He was working with a builder who had passed through the fire and built something that survived. They rebuilt the damaged sections of the mat together. Thomas showed Calvin a refinement. Instead of a single thick layer of brush, alternate 2 thinner layers with their grain running perpendicular. This created a denser screen with more air channels, so the shade was deeper and the wind passed through more easily. Calvin recognized the principle immediately. It was the same logic as cross-laminated wood, where perpendicular grain direction strengthened the whole. And Thomas saw him recognize it and nodded. "Your father taught you that," Thomas said. "In wagons, not in shade. The wood does not care what it is building." They worked side by side, and in the heat and the rhythm of it, Thomas told Calvin things he had not told him before. About the saguaro harvest camps east of the river, where families lived for weeks under shade structures that were rebuilt every season. About the way the O'odham read the desert not as an enemy to defeat, but as a set of conditions to respect. About his wife, who had died 4 years before, and who had been the one who taught him that the best joint is the one that lets the wood move. Calvin told Tomas about the wagon shop in Ohio, about his father's hands, how they were square and thick and could feel a crack in an axle by running a thumb along the grain, about the blacksmith shed and the shadeboard, about his wife, Eliza, who had died of typhoid in 1877, and how the sound of Mara coughing in the hot cabin brought back the sound of Eliza coughing in the cold house, and how both sounds meant the same thing. Someone he loved was suffering, and he could not make the air right. Tomas said, "You came to the desert because the cold house failed you." Calvin said, "I came to the desert because Amos had land and I had nothing." That is the same thing. The third evening, Tomas sat on the north beam. He liked to sit up there, where the air moved and the view stretched to the mountains, and said something Calvin did not forget. "Do not make every house the same. Watch where the afternoon sun walks. It does not walk the same path across every wall. A shade that works on a south face may be useless on the west. A shade that saves a timber roof may suffocate an adobe room if the gap is wrong." The principle does not change. The application always does. Calvin asked if that was how the O'odham built, differently each time. "We build for the place," Tomas said, "not for the idea of a place." He left the next morning. He took his mule and his tools and left a coil of yucca rope hanging on Calvin's bench post. He said he would return when his fields were finished, which might be September, which might be later. He said Calvin did not need him for what came next. Calvin stood by the well and watched Tomas ride south toward Waukee, and the claim felt larger with him gone, not emptier, larger. As if the space Tomas had occupied had been a wall, and now that the wall was removed, Calvin could see further in every direction, including the directions that frightened him. He had the design. He had the skills. He had the principle and the proof and the hands to build. He did not have the man who had taught him what his hands were for. The yucca rope hung on the bench post and swayed in the wind that passed through the gap. Calvin watched it for a long time and then went back to work. The secondary crisis came through Quill, as Calvin had expected, but it wore a different face than he had feared. 3 weeks after the storm, a freighter camp 6 miles east of Tucson bought one of Quill's shade frames. Quill had seen the demand growing, Petra Ruiz, the blacksmith, the rancher's water trough, and he had done what Quill always did, found the cheapest way to sell the most expensive promise. He bought thin cottonwood poles, cut them to 12 feet, and sold them as shade kits with pre-cut crossbeams and bundles of brush. He did not include instructions for post depth, hole shape, lashing technique, or wind bracing. He sold lumber and called it shelter. The frame went up at the freighter camp in a single afternoon. 2-foot deep holes, no bell at the bottom, no stone chocks, no outward rake. The brush mat was nailed to the crossbeams, nailed, not lashed, so that the mat and the frame were a single, rigid unit. There were no sacrificial gaps. Calvin heard about the sale and said nothing. He could not stop Quill from selling lumber. He could not force a buyer to dig deeper holes. The monsoon returned in late July, not the full-strength outflow that had tested Calvin's canopy, but a secondary burst. Gusty, sharp, the kind of wind that blows hard for 10 minutes, and then stops, and then blows again from a different direction. The freighter camp's shade frame lasted through the first gust. The second gust, coming from the northeast instead of the south, caught the rigid mat broadside. The nails held the mat to the frame. The frame held the mat to the posts. The posts, 2 feet deep in unbelled holes, pulled out of the ground like fence stakes. The frame fell onto stored grain. 300 pounds of lumber, brush, and ironwork collapsed onto a stack of flour sacks and meal bags and pinned a boy's leg beneath the center beam. The boy was 12, the son of the lead freighter, and his scream was heard at the cattle pen a quarter mile away. Calvin arrived on horseback with Alejandra. The scene was precisely what he had been afraid of since Quill started selling kits. A crowd of men pulling at debris in the wrong order, trying to lift the beam by brute force while the mat dragged against the grain sacks and the boy screamed. Pulling the beam would shift the mat. Shifting the mat would drag the cross pieces. The cross pieces would roll the center post, which was lying across the boy's shin. Calvin shouted. The men stopped. In the silence, he could hear the boy breathing, fast, shallow, the breathing of pain and fear. "Cut the mat first," Calvin said. "Do not pull the beam. Cut the mat off the cross beam so the frame is loose, then lift the beam straight up." A freighter said, "We need to get the beam off him now." If you pull the beam sideways, the cross rail rolls across his leg and breaks it. Cut the mat. Then the beam lifts clean. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the right idea still has to be built the right way. Alejandra had already found a hatchet. She began chopping the nailed brush free from the nearest crossbeam, and two men joined her, and the sound of hatchets splitting brittle wood filled the camp, while Calvin knelt beside the boy and kept his hands on the beam to feel for any shifting. The mat came free in sections. Each section released tension from the frame. When enough brush was cleared, Calvin called for the wagon jacks. The same tools he had used for 14 years to lift freight wagons with broken axles. 2 jacks went under the center beam, one on each side of the boy's leg. Calvin pumped them in alternation, a half inch at a time, checking the boy's leg after each pump. The beam lifted. Alejandra slid a folded blanket under the boy's calf to protect it from the ground. Calvin pumped 2 more inches. The boy pulled his leg free. It was not broken. Bruised deep enough to swell black within the hour, but the bone held. The boy's father looked at Calvin and looked at the collapsed frame and said, "Will sold us this." Calvin said, "The posts were 2 feet deep." He said 2 feet was enough. It is not. The father looked at the pulled posts lying on the ground, the unbelled holes that had held nothing when the wind shifted, the nails still embedded in the brush where lashing should have been. He understood. Not the engineering, the betrayal. He had paid for shelter and received a trap. By the next morning, the story was in Tucson. Quill's shade kit had collapsed. A boy was nearly crippled. The posts were too shallow. The mat was nailed rigid. The design had none of the features that made Calvin's canopy survive the same season's wind. Calvin did not accuse Quill publicly. He did not need to. Alejandra did it for him. She stood in Quill's store in front of 4 customers and said, "You sold danger and called it lumber. A Ramada with 2-foot posts and no wind gaps is not shade. It is a deadfall. The boy's father should take that frame to the courthouse." Quill said, "I sold posts and crossbeams. I did not build it." Alejandra said, "You sold it as a shade kit. You put Calvin Morrow's design on your price list. You left out every detail that makes it stand." Quill's face did not change. He was a man who processed threat the way he processed debt, calmly, precisely, looking for the angle. "Oh, I left nothing out," he said. "I sold materials. How a man builds with materials is his own affair." But the damage was done. 4 customers had heard it. The freighter's father had filed a claim in Tucson. And the phrase that had followed Calvin through the summer, "Morrow's putting a sombrero on a coffin," now had a counterweight. Quill sold the coffin without the sombrero. Calvin built a teaching frame. He erected it on his claim between the cabin and the well, using the same dimensions and methods as the canopy but smaller. An 8 by 8 foot square, 4 posts, 1 crossbeam height, 1 mat layer. a demonstration model that anyone could examine at full scale. He began showing people the difference, not in words, in wood. He set one post in a shallow hole, 2 feet, no bell, no chocks, and another in a deep hole, 4 feet, belled, chalked, tamped. He invited visitors to push both. The shallow post wobbled, the deep post held. He nailed a brush panel to one crossbeam and lashed another panel with rawhide. He poured a bucket of water on both and let them dry for 2 days. Then he pulled each panel sideways. The nailed panel resisted, then cracked the crossbeam. The lashed panel flexed, absorbed the pull, and returned to its position. He built one corner with a solid mat and one corner with a sacrificial gap. He held a blanket behind each corner and fanned air at the mat with a board. The solid section caught the air and transferred the push through the blanket, flapping it. The gapped section let the air through, and the blanket barely moved. The demonstrations were silent arguments. Calvin did not mention quill. He did not say the words cheap, dangerous, or wrong. He showed what worked and what failed and let people draw their own conclusions. Beadle came to the teaching frame and watched 2 demonstrations. Then he asked Calvin to build a partial canopy over the west wall of his bunkhouse. Calvin agreed. Alejandra agreed to help. The 3 of them built it in 4 days, and the bunkhouse hands reported sleeping through the night for the first time since May. Petra Ruiz finished her partial canopy with her son's help. Calvin checked it once and corrected one post angle. The rest was sound. Mariano Teles, a Mexican-American farmer with a sick mother, built a shade screen over her bedroom window using Calvin's technique. The old woman, who had spent 3 summers lying in heat that made her joints swell, told Teles she could breathe again. Each build taught Calvin something about teaching. Some people understood depth and angle. Some people understood lashing. Almost no one understood the gap without seeing it. The 4-foot airspace between shade and roof was the hardest principle to convey because it was invisible. It was an absence, a nothing, a deliberate emptiness that did all the work. People wanted to close the gap. They wanted to bring the shade down onto the roof because that seemed like more protection. Calvin learned to show them. He held a lit candle under the canopy and watched the flame lean sideways, drawn by the air moving through the gap. Then he held the same candle under a board laid flat on the cabin roof, no gap, and the flame stood straight up in trapped heat. The candle was the argument. Moving air was the answer. The gap was not nothing. It was the engine. By late July, 3 households between Tucson and Hueque had functioning shade structures built on Calvin's principles. Alejandra had shaded her work court, where she could now mix adobe through the afternoon instead of stopping at 10. A blacksmith had shaded his quenching trough. And Calvin's claim, the plank and log shack that everyone had called a coffin, sat under a patched, storm-tested, wind-scarred canopy that kept the interior 30 degrees cooler than the sun-struck surface of the roof, and made the difference between a child who slept and a child who suffered. Calvin had not yet made the August payment. He had $4.60. He owed $20. Quill had not mentioned the debt since the freighter collapse, but the paper was still signed and the courthouse still held the notice. The well was still at stake. But Beadle paid Calvin $12 for the bunkhouse shade, and Petra Ruiz traded a season's worth of dried corn, and the rancher whose water trough now sat in shade sent $4 in coin with a note that said only, "Works." Calvin counted the money on the cabin step. 12 plus 4 was 16. He had $4.60. $20.60. The payment was $20. He walked to Quill's store on the 1st of August and laid $20 on the counter. Quill looked at the money. He looked at Calvin. He opened the ledger, recorded the payment, and said nothing. He did not congratulate. He did not acknowledge that the canopy had survived or that the teaching had generated income or that the boy at the freighter camp had nearly lost his leg to Quill's shortcut. Calvin said, "The remaining balance is $41. Quill said, $41.15. Calvin nodded and left. Outside, the sun was past noon, and the temperature was over 100 degrees. Calvin walked home in the open light. He did not hurry. The heat pressed on his shoulders and neck and forearms, and he felt it the way he now felt all heat, as a force with a direction, something that could be intercepted, redirected, escaped. The sun was not an enemy. It was a condition, and conditions could be answered. The canopy was visible from half a mile away. It sat above the dark timber shack like a hand held over a sleeping child's face, not touching, not enclosing, just blocking the thing that would do harm if it arrived unchecked. Mara was outside when he reached the claim. She was sitting under the canopy, not inside the cabin, in the shade that extended past the walls. She was playing with a strip of white cloth Alejandra had given her, tying it to a stick and holding it up to watch the wind pull it sideways through the gap. "Papa," she said, "the wind is going up." Calvin watched the cloth strip lift and flutter, pulled by the thermal current rising through the mat. "Yes," he said, "that is where it belongs." Calvin built Alejandra's work court shade in the first week of August, and the courtship happened the way desert things happen, slowly, in heat, with both parties pretending it was something else. The work court was a 12 by 16-foot rectangle of packed earth where Alejandra mixed adobe, shaped bricks, and stacked them to cure. It faced south and west, which meant the afternoon sun turned the mixing water warm before it could bond with the mud, and the bricks dried too fast on the surface and cracked. She needed shade from noon to 5. Calvin needed to learn adobe, because 3 households had already asked him whether the canopy could be combined with mud wall repairs, and he could not answer a question about a material he had never shaped. The arrangement was practical. Calvin cut and hauled posts. Alejandra dug holes. Calvin set the frame. Alejandra mixed the tamping earth. She insisted on a specific clay ratio that packed denser than the raw dirt Calvin had used. And the posts sat so solid in her mix that Calvin could not shift them with a pry bar. They argued about the mat. Calvin wanted a thick layer for maximum shade. Alejandra wanted a thinner layer because the work court needed some direct light in the early morning for the bricks to begin their initial set. They compromised. A dense mat over the mixing area and a thinner mat over the curing racks, with the transition angled so the morning sun could reach the bricks until 10, and then the shade took over. It was the first time Calvin had designed a shade structure for someone else's work rather than his own survival, and the difference changed everything. He had to watch Alejandra work. He had to understand where she stood, where the water buckets sat, where the forms were stacked, where the sun hit first, and where it lingered last. He had to study her the way Thomas had studied the desert, not as a problem to solve, but as a set of conditions to respect. Alejandra noticed him watching and said, "You're looking at the court the way I look at a cracked wall." Calvin said, "I am trying to see where the shade needs to be." "It needs to be where the work is." "The work moves." "Then the shade must be generous enough to cover the movement." He widened the overhang by 2 feet on the south side. The extra shade cost him an afternoon of cutting and hauling brush, but when Alejandra mixed her first batch under the finished canopy, she worked until 4 in the afternoon without stopping, and the water in her mixing trough stayed cool enough that the mud bonded properly and the bricks did not crack. She stood at the edge of the shade and looked at the line where the sun began. She reached her hand out into the light and then pulled it back into the shadow, and the contrast was visible on her skin, red heat and brown cool, separated by an edge as sharp as a knife. "The principle is simple," she said. "The execution is not." Calvin said, "That is what Thomas told me." "Thomas is right about most things." She paused. "You are right about some." It was the closest she had come to a compliment, and Calvin accepted it the way he accepted the desert, carefully, without assuming it would last. Their partnership developed through shared labor in the weeks that followed, and neither called it anything but work until everyone else in the valley had already named it something else. Calvin repaired Alejandra's wagon brake on a Wednesday. The brake shoe was worn to bare metal, and the lever arm had a hairline crack running from the pivot bolt down through the cheek plate. Calvin drilled out the crack, inserted a steel pin crosswise to stop the split from traveling, and shimmed the brake shoe with a piece of hardened mesquite. The repair took 3 hours and saved Alejandra the $12 a new brake assembly would cost from Quill's store. Alejandra corrected Calvin's first attempt at mixing adobe on a Thursday. He'd used too much water, not enough straw, and the wrong clay, a surface deposit that was half sand. She crouched beside his mixing trough and showed him how to test the mud. Roll a ball the size of a walnut, drop it from waist height, and read the crack pattern. Too wet, and it flattens. Too dry, and it shatters. Right. And it holds its shape with a single fracture line running from the impact point. Calvin dropped 6 balls before he got one that cracked correctly, and Alejandra watched each one without comment until the 6th, when she said, "That one would build a wall." He built her a new mixing bench with a shade screen on the west side. She patched the cracks in his cabin's south wall with adobe skim that she mixed on-site and troweled into the gaps with the flat of her hand. The skim was not structural. It was insulation, a thin layer of mass over the timber that would slow heat transfer through the wall the way the canopy slowed heat transfer through the roof. Calvin noticed that Alejandra arrived earlier each week and stayed later. He noticed that she brought food, tortillas, dried beans, strips of carne seca, and set them on the bench without announcement. He noticed that Mara had begun following Alejandra around the work court, handing her tools before she asked for them, and that Alejandra spoke to Mara in Spanish, and Mara answered in broken Spanish that improved daily. Beetle Crow, who noticed everything and said almost nothing, rode past one evening and saw Calvin and Alejandra sitting on opposite ends of the bench eating corn cake while Mara played between them with the white cloth strip tied to a stick. Beetle said, "You two look like a gate that has not figured out it has hinges." Calvin said, "I do not know what that means." Beetle said, "You will," and rode on. The second summer brought the design Calvin had been building towards since the storm. Version 2 of the shade canopy corrected everything the first version had survived but not solved. 6 posts minimum for any house-sized structure, with the 2 center posts carrying the main beam weight and the 4 corners handling wind load. Diagonal bracing on all 4 faces, not just the windward 2. Wider overhang on the west and south sides, 5 feet instead of 4, because the low afternoon sun angled beneath the shallow overhang and struck the wall. A broken shade edge rather than a solid perimeter, so the canopy's profile presented less area to lateral gusts, and replaceable brush panels lashed in sections that could be pulled and rewoven without dismantling the frame. Alejandra added adobe skirting around the bottom of Calvin's cabin, a 2-foot-high wall of mud brick running along the south and west foundations, thick enough to absorb ground-level heat that the canopy did not block. The combination of overhead shade and base mass turned the cabin into something neither Calvin nor Alejandra could have built alone. A timber structure protected from above by interception and from below by thermal mass. The interior temperature in July of the second summer never exceeded 92 degrees. The previous July, before the canopy, it had reached 109. Calvin recorded the numbers in a small ledger he kept beside the thermometer. The ledger was not for publication or proof. It was for the next person who asked whether the shade worked. He could hand them the book and say nothing, and the numbers would make the argument. Alejandra began incorporating shade principles into her adobe work. She designed a shaded mixing court for a customer in Tucson, a merchant who wanted to expand his warehouse but could not work construction crews past 10 in the morning. The court had 6 posts, a mesquite frame, and a shade mat that Alejandra wove herself using the 2-layer perpendicular technique Tomas had taught Calvin. The merchant paid $35. Alejandra gave Calvin $10 for the postwork and kept the rest. It was the first time Calvin had been paid for someone else building his design, and the realization sat in his chest like a warm stone. The idea had become larger than his hands. Quill did not disappear. He adapted, which was worse, because adaptation in a man like Quill meant finding new ways to extract profit from other people's risk. After the freighter collapse, Quill stopped selling shade kits. The legal claim was still moving through Tucson's court, slowly, as frontier courts moved, and Quill's name was attached to the collapsed frame. He shifted. He began offering construction credit, loans for materials charged at 8% interest to settlers who wanted to build shade structures. The materials were still thin cottonwood. The credit terms were still Quill's terms, and the settlers who took the loans often could not pay them on time, which meant Quill collected interest or, in 2 cases, took partial claims as payment. Calvin heard about the credit scheme from George Lott, the freighter who had asked about Tomas. George said, "Quill is lending money for shade frames. He's charging more for the credit than the frames are worth." Calvin said, "The frames are not worth anything if the posts are 2 feet deep." "He does not care about the posts. He cares about the paper." It was the same pattern. Quill did not build. He sold. He did not shelter. He collected. And the people who borrowed from him were the same people who could not afford to hire Calvin or buy materials outright. The poorest, the most desperate, the ones for whom a shade frame was not a convenience but a necessity. Calvin could not compete with Quill on price. He could not offer free labor to every household that needed shade. He could not outrun a storekeeper who held credit lines and ledger books and the patience to wait for default. What he could do was teach. He expanded the demonstration frame on his claim. He added a second teaching station, a set of post holes at different depths, pre-dug, so visitors could see the profile at 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet without digging themselves. He kept a supply of rawhide, yucca fiber, and iron straps, and he showed people how to lash each type and when to use which. He cut mesquite poles to standard lengths and stacked them where anyone could take one and replace it with a pole they cut themselves later. The teaching was not charity, it was defense. Every household that learned to build a proper shade frame was a household that did not need Quill's credit. Every post set 4 feet deep was a post that would not pull out and collapse on a child. Every lashing tied correctly was a lashing that would not crack in the wind. Quill understood what Calvin was doing. He understood it the way a man understands a leak in his own boat, clearly, precisely, and with growing alarm. But he could not stop it. He could not sell against free knowledge. He could not undercut a man who gave the information away. And he could not mock the design anymore, because the design had survived a storm, saved a ranch hand, and cooled 9 households. And the phrase sombrero on a coffin now sounded like the punchline to a joke the teller did not understand. The final reckoning came in July of the second summer, during a heat spell that lasted 11 days. Quill's storeroom was dark timber with a flat plank roof. He had built it the same way Amos had built the cabin: no adobe, no porch, no shade, no lime wash. He had built it that way because lumber was what he sold, and adobe was what other people used. And Quill did not take advice from people he considered beneath him, which was everyone. By the fourth day of the heat spell, the storeroom was unbearable. Flour stored against the south wall grew warm enough that the moisture inside the sacks condensed and the flour began to clump. Medicine bottles on the upper shelf heated past the point where the pharmacy's instructions said they should be stored. A tin of lard melted and ran off the shelf and pooled on the floor. Quill's own thermometer, which he had purchased to prove that Calvin's temperature claims were exaggerated, read 114 degrees at 2 in the afternoon inside the storeroom. Customers stopped coming inside. They stood at the door and called their orders in and waited while Quill brought items out. Some moved their stored goods to other locations. 2 families asked Calvin whether they could keep flour and medicine under his canopy until the heat broke. Calvin said yes. On the 7th day, Quill opened his store at dawn and found a bag of cornmeal split along the seam where heat expansion had stressed the stitching. The meal was full of weevils that had bred in the warmth. He swept the ruined corn into the street and stood in his own doorway looking at the plank roof that was doing to his goods exactly what it had done to Mara, cooking them slowly, relentlessly, without pause. On the 9th day, Quill walked to Colvin's claim. He did not ride. He walked, which meant the trip took 90 minutes in the July heat, and by the time he arrived, his shirt was soaked and his face was the color of fired brick, and his breathing was visible from 20 feet. Calvin was on the teaching frame, replacing a section of brush with Mara's help. Mara now strong enough to hand tools up and pull lashing tight. Alejandra was mixing adobe at her work court under shade. Beetle Crow happened to be present, examining a new lashing variant Calvin had developed for acute angle braces. Quill stopped at the edge of the shade. He looked at the canopy above him. He looked at the teaching frame. He looked at the cabin, cool inside, where Mara had been sleeping through the night for 2 months. "Build it the proper way, then," Quill said. His voice was flat. There was no warmth in it, no conversion, no moment of grace or understanding. It was the voice of a man who had run out of alternatives and was purchasing the only thing left on the shelf. "And put my name nowhere near it." Beetle looked at Quill. Alejandra looked at Quill. Calvin climbed down from the frame and stood in front of the man who had called his canopy a folly, his design a sombrero on a coffin, his methods Indian tricks, and his august payment an inevitability of failure. Calvin said, "The posts go 4 feet deep. The gap between the shade and the roof is 4 feet. The mat is layered and loose. The price is $25 for materials and labor." Quill said, "Fine. And the remaining balance on my brother's account is forgiven." Quill's mouth tightened. The remaining balance was $21.15. Combined with the shade frame cost, Calvin was asking for $46.15 of value in exchange for a structure Quill had spent the entire summer trying to destroy. Quill looked at the cabin. He looked at the thermometer hanging inside the door, reading 91 degrees at noon on the 7th day of a heat spell that had turned his own store into a ruin. "Fine," Quill said. He turned and walked back toward Tucson. He did not thank Calvin. He did not acknowledge Beetle or Alejandra. He walked, and the sun pressed on his back, and every step of the 90-minute return was a step through heat that Calvin had learned to answer and Quill had spent a year denying. Alejandra watched him go and said quietly, to no one in particular, "That is not a man who has learned. That is a man who has lost." Calvin said, "He will get his shade." "I know. That is why it is sad." Calvin and Alejandra married at San Xavier del Bac in the autumn of 1880, after the monsoon season ended, and the air cooled enough for a walk to the mission without arriving soaked. The ceremony was small. Beetle stood as witness. Tomas was invited but could not come. His own family obligations at Waukee had deepened as his eldest son prepared for marriage, and he sent a bundle of yucca fiber with a note that said only, "For the next thing you build." Mara placed a strip of white cloth on the highest beam of the canopy the morning of the wedding, not as decoration, as a test. The cloth lifted and fell in the thermal current rising through the gap, showing the invisible engine that kept the cabin cool, air moving upward, heat leaving, the space between the shade and the roof doing the work that no one could see. The white strip became a marker. Visitors to the claim could see it from the road, a flicker of pale fabric on a mesquite beam, moving when there was no wind because the air itself was always moving through the gap. People who had shade structures of their own began tying similar strips to their canopies, and the strips became the way you knew, from a distance, that a household understood the principle, not the shape. The principle. Air must move or heat becomes trapped. The years that followed compressed the way frontier years compress, not smoothly, but in stacks of work and weather, and small emergencies that blur into a single feeling of persistence. Calvin built 14 shade structures in 1880, working with Alejandra on every project that involved adobe, working alone or with hired help on the timber-only jobs. The Southern Pacific Railroad reached Tucson in March of 1880, and the lumber that had been ruinously expensive by wagon suddenly became affordable by rail. The change should have helped Calvin, but it also helped Quill, who began importing cheap pine in bulk. Calvin's advantage was never the material. It was the knowledge, the post depth, the gap, the lashing, the sacrificial openings, the layered mat, and knowledge could not be shipped by rail. Alejandra's adobe business grew alongside Calvin's shade work. Households that hired Calvin for a canopy often hired Alejandra for wall repairs or skirting, and the two trades complemented each other so naturally that customers began asking for both by name, Morrow Shade and Carrillo Walls. It was a partnership built on different materials shaped by the same understanding, that the desert was not hostile, only honest, and that a building which respected the honesty could last. Mara grew. She learned to mix adobe from Alejandra, and to cut mesquite from Calvin, and to lash joints with yucca fiber, using a technique Thomas had taught her during his last visit in the autumn of 1879. She kept the mercury thermometer her father had hung in the cabin doorway, and she checked it every afternoon the way other children checked the sky for rain, by habit, by instinct, by the quiet understanding that temperature was not just a number, but a story about what the air was doing and what the building was allowing. Calvin never became rich. The claim stayed small. The cabin stayed humble beneath its patched, wind-tested canopy. The original shade mat had been rebuilt 3 times by the second year, and each rebuild was better than the last. Tighter weave, denser layers, a broken edge that whispered wind through instead of catching it. The posts never moved. The belled holes, the stone chocks, the 2-finger outward rake. These held season after season, storm after storm, because Tomas had built them to hold, and Calvin had learned why they held, and the ground had accepted both. Tomas visited once more in the winter of 1881. He was older. His hands were slower, but no less sure. He walked the claim and looked at the canopy, which by then had been expanded to cover a second work bay where Calvin repaired wagons under shade, and he looked at the teaching frame, which had been used by more than 20 visitors, and he looked at the white cloth strip lifting and falling on the highest beam. Calvin was showing a young builder, a railroad man who wanted to shade a section house west of Tucson, how to test a post angle. He held a weighted string against the post and said, 2 fingers width outward at the top. The wind pushes the post tighter into the ground instead of pulling it out. Tomas heard him. He stood at the edge of the shade and listened to Calvin say the words he had said 2 summers before in the same tone, with the same patience, to a man who needed to hear them the way Calvin had once needed to hear them. Calvin saw Thomas. Their eyes met across the teaching frame. Calvin did not stop his demonstration. Thomas did not interrupt. The young builder finished his measurement, set the weighted string aside, and said, "Who taught you that?" Calvin said, "A man named Thomas Antone. He is standing behind you." The young builder turned. Thomas nodded. Not a greeting, a confirmation. The same nod he had given Calvin when the shade principle proved sound on a flat board in the sun. That evening, Thomas sat on the north beam one last time. The air was cool. Winter in the Sonoran Desert was kind, the kind of season that made people forget what summer demanded, and the stars above the canopy were visible through the thin spots in the mat where brush had been replaced, and the weave was not yet tight. "You are teaching them the reason," Thomas said. "Not the shape." Calvin said, "You told me to." "I told you many things. You listened to that one." "It was the most important one." Thomas looked south toward Waukee. "The shape changes, the reason does not. When people copy a thing, they copy the shape first. You are teaching them to copy the reason. That is harder, and it is better, and it is the only thing that lasts." He left the next morning. Calvin did not see him again for 2 years, and by then Thomas moved more slowly and stayed shorter, but his hand still tested every joint he touched, and his nod still meant the same thing it had always meant. The evidence is sound. By the third summer, 9 households between Tucson and Waukee used some form of Calvin's adapted shade canopy, not identical, not branded, not sold as miracle architecture. Some shaded work courts, some shaded sick rooms. 2 covered whole plank roofs the way Calvin's original covered his cabin. The important spread was not the object, but the principle. Stop the sun before it touches the house. Keep the gap. Let the air move. Build for the place, not for the idea of a place. Calvin and Alejandra lived out their working years near the lower Santa Cruz. He repaired wagons. She shaped walls. Together they corrected buildings that heat had made unlivable, and together they taught that the first wall in summer is not always a wall, it is shade. Mara survived childhood and grew into a young woman who kept the mercury thermometer in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, the glass clouded, the scale still readable. Tomas's yucca rope hung above Calvin's bench long after it was too brittle to use, and when visitors asked about it, Calvin said, "It was a gift from my teacher," and left it at that. Years later, the old cabin still sat beneath patched shade. The timber walls were dark as the day Amos built them, but the sun no longer owned them. Wind moved through the gap the way wind had always moved through the gap, upward, outward, carrying heat away from a child who once lay on a packed earth floor because it was the coolest surface she could find. The canopy creaked in gusts and held in storms and lost brush panels every monsoon and gained new ones every autumn, and the posts stood in their belled holes, raked outward, chalked with stone, tamped in layers, as fixed as the day Tomas set them. Outside, the white cloth strip lifted and fell from the highest beam. Mara had replaced it 4 times. The cloth wore thin, and the sun bleached it, and the wind frayed the edges, but the movement never stopped, because the air between the shade and the roof never stopped moving, because the gap was not empty. The gap was the engine. The gap was the answer. Quill's store still stood on the road to Tucson, dark-roofed and hot-walled, but now it wore a mesquite and brush canopy that Calvin had built in the summer of 1880, 4 posts deep, 4 feet of air between shade and timber, sacrificial gaps cut into the south mat. Quill had never thanked Calvin. He had never said the canopy worked. He had simply stopped sweeping spoiled flour into the street. The house had not beaten the desert. It had simply learned where to stand in relation to the sun.